A $2 billion tower, 6 hours before the seismic retrofit goes live. Then, a janitor in graphite gray coveralls walked in, his 5-year-old daughter clutching a folded paper crane. The architect sneered. "This is a working model, not a coloring book. Get your child away from it." 6 hours later, the foundation cracked under every pier she had just approved. Eleanor Pollard had inherited her father's architecture firm 5 years ago. She arrived at the Cresthaven lobby at 6:18 with her project lead and her press attaché beside her, expecting only the kind of small ceremony money paid for. Then she saw him at the lobby model, a man in graphite gray coveralls, a docent's pencil in his hand, the tip resting on the base of Pier 14, his daughter beside him, a paper crane in her fingers. She crossed the lobby in 19 strides. She did not call out, she did not signal, she simply arrived. In front of her project lead, her press attaché, and 2 members of the structural review board, she ended his employment. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not mention that he had drawn that pier himself 22 years ago on the 7th floor of the building they were now standing inside. He took his daughter's hand and walked out through the service door. What no one in that lobby knew was that the man she had just fired was the only person alive who could keep her tower standing past midnight. Stay with this one. It earns it. To understand what cracked at 12:18 that night, you have to go back to the lobby of Cresthaven Tower at 6:14 in the morning. The building was 48 stories of polished concrete and graphite-tinted glass. It sat on the corner of Bowman and 8th in the downtown district, and on every architectural register in the country, it was listed as the work of Pollard and Vance, completed 22 years prior. The Vance on the second half of that name had not been mentioned in firm literature for 19 years. The reasons were not in any press release. The reasons were filed instead in a sealed memorandum in the Structural Review archives, and in a single line on the original calculations sheet that someone had drawn through with a black marker before the project went to permit. The man who had drawn that line was named Hugo Pollard. He had died in 2018. His daughter Eleanor had inherited the firm the year after. She did not know about the memorandum. She did not know about the line through the calculations. She only knew that the tower her father had built was the cornerstone of her portfolio, and that the seismic retrofit that would be activated tonight was going to be the centerpiece of her TED Talk in November. The man in the graphite coveralls was named Silas Vance. He was 51 years old, broad in the shoulders, with the particular quiet of a man who had spent a long time learning not to be noticed. His hair was the color of pencil lead, cut short. His hands were calloused from 22 years of holding a mop handle and 22 years before that of holding a drafting pencil. He had a small white scar across the knuckle of his right index finger from a compass point that had slipped during his second year at MIT. The scar was older than his daughter. He punched in every morning at 5:50. He swept the lobby. He waxed the service floors. He emptied the trash bins in the north stairwell and the south stairwell and the parking garage. He did not look at the lobby model when he walked past it. He had taught himself not to look at it. He had taught himself the same way a man teaches himself not to look at a photograph of someone he has buried. His daughter's name was Wren. She was 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes, which were a soft brown, and her father's silence, which she had inherited the way some children inherit a piano they cannot yet play. She carried a paper crane everywhere she went. The crane was folded from a piece of pale gray hospital paper, and it had begun to soften at the edges from being held too many times. Her mother, Hannah, had folded it for her in the oncology ward at St. Bridget's Hospice, 4 blocks north of Cresthaven Tower, in the last week of her life. Hannah had been a high school librarian. She had been 38 years old. The leukemia had been diagnosed in March and had taken her by July. That had been 3 years ago, and Wren was small enough then that she remembered her mother the way a person remembers a song from a room they had walked through as a child. She remembered the folding of the crane. She did not remember much else. and the crane, accordingly, was the only object she would not be separated from. Silas took the janitorial job at Cresthaven for one reason only, and the reason was 4 blocks long. St. Bridget's was 4 blocks north. The walk from Cresthaven's service door to the bench where Hannah had sat in the courtyard during chemotherapy was exactly 9 minutes, even in winter. He had not been able to leave the bench. He had not been able to leave the courtyard. He had not been able to leave the 4 blocks. The building he had designed at 29 had become the only building he could stand to enter, because every morning when he passed St. Bridget's on his way to work, he could nod at the courtyard, and every evening on his way home, he could nod at it again. The child care arrangement was simple. A retired neighbor named Margaret Sloan, who had been an obstetrics nurse for 40 years, picked Wren up from kindergarten at 3 and kept her until Silas got off shift at 6. Margaret refused payment. Margaret had been Hannah's friend. The lobby model was the centerpiece of Eleanor Pollard's brand. It sat on a circular oak plinth at the center of the entryway, lit from above by recessed daylight bulbs that were calibrated to match the actual sky outside. The model was a 1:150 scale rendering of Cresthaven Tower in cast acrylic, with the foundation piers visible in cutaway through a graphite-tinted lower section. There were 16 piers in total, each labeled with a small brass plate on the plinth, Pier 1 through Pier 16. The model had been built to demonstrate the new seismic retrofit, which was a system of carbon fiber load redistribution sleeves that wrapped each pier and transferred lateral force from the building's mass into a series of reinforced footings beneath the parking garage. The retrofit was a $140 million contract. It was scheduled to be activated electronically at 6 o'clock that evening at a ribbon cutting attended by the mayor, the building's insurance carrier, and 2 members of the city council. At 6:14 that morning, Silas was sweeping the marble around the oak plinth. He did not, ordinarily, look at the model. He had taught himself this. But Wren was with him. Margaret Sloan had broken her ankle on Tuesday. There was no one to keep Wren that morning, and the shift could not be missed, because Silas had used 3 of his 5 allotted sick days during Hannah's final week, and his supervisor had a long memory. So Wren had come to work with him, dressed in a small gray coat that Hannah had bought her in the 2nd week of treatment, holding the paper crane in her left hand, sitting quietly on the bench by the security desk. Silas had been sweeping. Wren had been watching. And then, from across the lobby, Wren had said, in the small, clear voice of a 5-year-old, "Papa, why is the one in the back smaller than the others?" Silas had stopped sweeping. He had not, until that moment, looked directly at the model in 19 years. He had walked past it 800 times. He had swept around it 500 times. He had never looked at it. He looked at it now, because his daughter had asked him a question, and his daughter did not ask questions she had not first decided were worth answering. He saw the 16 piers. He saw the brass labels. He saw, in cutaway, the new carbon fiber retrofit sleeves, drawn in a paler graphite to indicate the upgrade. He saw, forth from the back on the eastern side, Pier 14. And he saw, the way a man sees the face of his own brother in a crowd, that Pier 14 was 8% narrower than the other piers around it. He set the broom against the plinth. He walked slowly around the model. He looked at Pier 14 from 3 sides. In the original calculations of 2003, Pier 14 had been specified at 1.4 meters in diameter. The seismic load distribution for the southeast quadrant of the building had been calculated against that diameter. The cost differential between a 1.4-meter pier and a 1.3-meter pier was approximately $42,000 per pier, and there were 6 piers in the southeast quadrant, which meant that reducing the southeast diameter by 10 centimeters would save the firm approximately $252,000 on a $48 million bid. And it was, accordingly, exactly the kind of decision that Hugo Pollard had been famous for making at 3 in the morning on the last night before a permit deadline. Silas had refused to sign off on the change. Hugo had pushed it through anyway, under his own seal, after Silas had walked out of the project for what was supposed to be a 1-week leave to bury his father. Silas had returned 8 days later. The plans had been re-stamped. His name had been quietly removed from the masthead 3 months after. He looked at the model now, and he saw in the new retrofit drawings that the load redistribution from the sleeves was being calculated against the original 2003 diameter, which was 1.4, not the as-built diameter, which was 1.3. The retrofit, in other words, was doubling the lateral load applied to a pier that was already 8% undersized for the load it had been carrying for 22 years. He picked up a pencil. There was a pencil at the docent's desk, a soft graphite B, the kind that architecture students used. He had not held a drafting pencil in 19 years. The weight of it was the weight of an old grief. He walked back to the lobby model. He laid the pencil tip against the protective acrylic over Pier 14. He drew, very lightly, a corrected line. It was not a damaging line, the acrylic was meant to be wiped, but it was a line, and it was a line drawn by a man who had once known exactly where it should go. Wren had walked over while he was drawing. She stood at his hip, the paper crane in her hand. She watched the line. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Is the building sick, Papa?" Silas looked down at her. He thought about what to say. He thought about Hannah, who had spent 6 months in a building 4 blocks away, sick in a way that no one could pencil correct. He thought about how to explain to a 5-year-old that buildings were sick in different ways than people. He could not find the words, so he said, "It has a sore spot, little one. Right here." He pointed at the line he had drawn. The doctors didn't notice it. Wren considered this with the gravity that small children bring to grown-up questions. She nodded once. She put the paper crane on the plinth beside the brass label that said Pier 14. She said, "He can sit with it." The lobby's revolving door turned at 6:18. Eleanor Pollard stepped through it in a charcoal wool coat, the same shade as the model's tinted base. Her project lead was a man named Devin Halsey, 34, in a tailored navy suit. Her press attaché was a woman named Priya Khan, holding a slim leather folio with the day's schedule. Eleanor was 36 years old. She had been on the cover of Architectural Digest in March. She had given a TED Talk in October on what she called the inheritance of stone, which was a phrase her speechwriter had given her and which had since appeared in 2 trade publications. She walked, in expensive leather flats, the way her father had walked, which was the walk of a person who has never been asked to wait for an elevator. She saw the man at the model. She saw the pencil. She saw the line over Pier 14. She did not see the daughter at first, because the daughter was small and on the far side of the plinth. Devin Halsey saw the line over Pier 14 and made a small sound through his teeth. He stepped half a pace forward, the way a man steps in front of his boss when he wants to be seen handling it. He said, Sir, this is a working model. You can't draw on this. Please step back from the plinth." Silas stepped back. He did not say anything. He set the pencil down on the docent's desk, exactly where he had found it. Eleanor crossed the lobby in 19 strides. She did not call out. She did not signal. She simply arrived, the way she arrived everywhere, which was as if the room had been waiting for her. She looked at the line on the acrylic. She looked at the man in the graphite coveralls. She looked, finally, at the very small girl standing at his hip with a paper crane on the plinth beside the brass plate. Her face, which had been composed, became composed in a different and more specific way. "This is a working model, not a coloring book," Eleanor said. "Get your child away from it." She said it the way a person says a sentence she has rehearsed for cameras she did not realize were not there. Her voice was quiet. It carried. The 2 members of the Structural Review Board, who had walked in behind her to set up for the ribbon cutting, both turned their heads. Priya Khan, who had been about to open the folio, paused with her hand on the cover. Devin Halsey looked at his shoes. Silas did not look at Eleanor. He looked at his daughter. He bent down to her eye level. He picked up the paper crane from the plinth very gently and pressed it into Wren's small hand. He folded her fingers around it. He said, in the voice he used for nothing else in the world, "Time to go, little bird." Eleanor was not finished. She was not, as a rule, finished until she had been the last person to speak. "You are dismissed," she said. "Effective immediately. Building services will be informed. Your access card will not work after 7. If you have personal belongings in the staff locker room, you may collect them now, and you will be escorted out." She paused. She added, the way her father had added things, "I do not want to see this man in this lobby again." Silas straightened. He did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at Devon Halsey. He did not look at the 2 members of the Structural Review Board who were now openly watching. He looked at the lobby model one more time. He looked at Pier 14. He looked at the pale graphite line he had drawn over it. He took his daughter's hand. He walked, without hurry, toward the service door. At the service door, he paused. He turned, halfway. He did not raise his voice. He spoke just loud enough that the 2 members of the Structural Review Board could hear him. He said, "The retrofit calculations are running against the design diameter, not the as-built. Pier 14 is at 1.3 meters, not 1.4. When you double the load tonight, you'll see hairline cracks in the parking levels by 10. Standing water by midnight. The first failure point will be the southeast footing." He paused. He added, "I am telling you this as a courtesy. Do with it what you want." He turned. He pushed the service door open. He stepped through it with his daughter beside him, the paper crane back in her hand. The door swung closed behind them. The lobby was very quiet. Eleanor laughed. Once. It was a small laugh, a single exhalation, almost a cough. She turned to Devon Halsey. "Find out who that was," she said. "Find out how building services hired a janitor with that kind of imagination. I want a report by lunch." Devon nodded. Priya Khan, who had not opened the folio, made a small note on the back cover with a pencil from the docent's desk. The 2 members of the Structural Review Board exchanged a look that they would later, in deposition, deny exchanging. One of them, a woman named Carla Bessie, who had been an engineer for 31 years, walked over to the lobby model. She did not touch the model. She looked at Pier 14. She looked at the pale graphite line. She looked at the small folded crane that had been left on the brass plate. She said, to no one in particular, "He drew it from memory." Silas and Wren walked north on 8th Street. The morning was overcast, the color of unwashed linen, with a low charcoal sky. They passed the corner of Bowman, where a vendor was setting out folded newspapers. They passed the dry cleaner, which Hannah had used for 9 years. They passed the courtyard at St. Bridget's Hospice. Silas slowed at the courtyard. He did not stop. He did not turn his head. He slowed enough that Wren, who was holding his hand and watching his face, slowed with him. The bench was empty. The maple Hannah had liked was just starting to lose its leaves, 3 weeks early, the way maples did in that part of the city. The leaves were the same graphite charcoal gray as everything else in Silas's life that morning. He kept walking. Wren did not ask why he had slowed. Wren never asked why he had slowed at St. Bridget's. She had, somehow, in the way of small children, understood without being told. They reached the apartment at 7:40. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick walk-up on Greer Avenue, 6 blocks north of St. Bridget's. It was a 1-bedroom. Wren slept in the bedroom on a small bed under a window. Silas slept on the fold-out in the living room. The apartment had 3 pieces of furniture that had been Hannah's: a reading chair, a small bookcase with 24 titles in it, and a watercolor on the wall by the kitchen that Hannah had painted in college, of a barn in Vermont in winter. The barn was graphite charcoal gray. Silas made Wren a piece of toast with butter and honey. He cut it into 4 small squares. He put it on the small blue plate that Wren preferred. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. He watched her eat. She held the paper crane in her left hand while she ate with her right. She did not put it down to eat. She had not put it down to eat in 3 years. He thought about what to do. He had been fired before, in a manner of speaking, and he had not fought it then, and he was not certain he could fight it now. The firm had taken his name off Cresthaven on a Tuesday in March of 2004. He had received a letter, single page, on firm letterhead, signed by Hugo Pollard, that thanked him for his contributions and informed him that, in light of his recent personal difficulties, the firm had decided to consolidate authorship under a single senior partner. The personal difficulties referred to the death of Silas's father, which had been a stroke, suddenly, on a Tuesday. Silas had not contested the letter. He had not contested the restamping of the plans. He had not contested anything. He had taken a small severance, which she had spent on Hannah's first round of fertility treatments 2 years later, which had given them Wren 4 years after that, which had given Wren the only year of her life with 2 parents. He had reasons for not fighting then. The first reason was that Hannah had not wanted him to. Hannah had grown up in a household with a father who fought everything, and she had said to him, sitting at the same kitchen table they were now eating breakfast at, "Silas, the building is going to stand. You did the math right. They'll never get a permit to do anything worse to it. Let them have the name. Don't let them have you." The second reason was that he had not, in fact, been wrong about Hugo Pollard. Hugo had pushed the change through, and Hugo had been very careful about how he had done it, and contesting the restamping would have meant a years-long civil action against a man who had 3 former state senators on his board. The third reason was that Silas was tired. He had buried his father on a Tuesday, and he had come back to the office on a Wednesday, and he had been told that his name was being removed. And he had simply, in the manner of a man who has run out of arguments, stopped arguing. He had taken work, eventually, where it was offered, which was facilities maintenance, which was where men with engineering degrees went when they did not want to engineer anymore. He had worked at 3 different buildings in 4 years. He had taken the Cresthaven shift in 2015, when the previous custodian had retired, and he had taken it because St. Bridget's was 4 blocks north, and Hannah had just begun what they were not yet calling a relapse. He had told no one at the building who he was. He had told no one at St. Bridget's who he was. He had told Hannah, eventually, that he had taken the job, and Hannah had looked at him with the same patience she had brought to 26 years of marriage, and she had said, "Of course you did, Silas. You wanted to be close." He had been close. He had been close enough to walk to her bench on his lunch break. He had been close enough to be the second person, after the chaplain, to know she was gone. At 8:15, the phone rang. The phone was a landline. Silas kept it because Margaret Sloane preferred it, and because the school nurse preferred it. The voice on the other end was a woman, professional, with the careful cadence of someone reading from a script. "Mr. Vance, this is Carla Bessie from the city's Structural Review Board. I am calling on a matter of public safety related to Cresthaven Tower. We have reason to believe you may have information relevant to the retrofit activation scheduled for tonight. Could you confirm your identity for me, please?" Silas confirmed his identity. There was a pause on the line. The pause had the texture of a person checking a name against a sealed document. Then Carla Bessie said, in a different and more specific voice, "Mr. Vance, are you the same Silas Vance who is listed as co-architect of record on the original Cresthaven permit filing from August 2003? Silas said yes. He hung up. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with his hand on the phone. The watercolor of the barn was on the wall in front of him, the graphite gray barn. He looked at it. He thought about the day Hannah had painted it, which was the autumn of 1999, in a small studio at the University of Vermont. She had been 23. He had been 27. He had driven up from Boston on a Friday with 2 bottles of cheap red wine and a sketch pad, and they had spent the weekend in a barn that was not actually gray, but which she had painted gray because the light that weekend had been gray. The way the light was gray now, 26 years and 1 funeral later. He had carried the watercolor through 4 apartments. It had been the last thing he had taken off the wall when they moved out of the house in Cambridge after she got sick. It had been the first thing he had hung in this apartment. Wren had asked him once why the barn was gray. He had told her, "Because your mother saw it that way." The phone rang again at 9:20. Carla Bessie again. The Structural Review Board had pulled the original permit filing. The board had cross-referenced the as-built survey from 2004. The board had reviewed the retrofit calculations that had been submitted by Pollard Architects in March. The board had a problem. The problem was the same problem that Silas had drawn a pencil line over at 6:15 that morning. The problem was Pier 14. The retrofit could not be activated at 6 this evening without restamping the plans, and the plans could not be restamped without the consent of the original designer of record. And the original designer of record, by the language of 2003's permitting statute, was the most senior named architect who had not subsequently filed a written withdrawal. Hugo Pollard had filed a withdrawal in 2020 on his retirement. Silas Vance had not. Silas Vance was the designer of record. The ribbon cutting could not, legally, proceed without him. He walked Wren to school at 9:50. The kindergarten was at St. Mary's, 12 blocks east. They took the slow route, the one that did not pass St. Bridget's, because Wren preferred the slow route on overcast days. The slow route went past a small park where there was a stone bench and a hawthorn tree. Wren liked the hawthorn tree because the berries in October were the color of her mother's coral lipstick. She told Silas every time they passed the hawthorn, "The berries are Mama's color." Silas said every time, "They are, little one." They walked. The paper crane was in her left hand, her right hand was in his. They reached the kindergarten gate at 10:02. Mrs. Aldana, the morning teacher, was at the gate. She raised her eyebrows at Silas, because Silas usually dropped Wren at 8:30. Silas said only, "Late start today." Mrs. Aldana, who had buried her own husband 3 years ago, nodded without asking. At 11:15, the buzzer on Silas's apartment door rang. Silas looked through the peephole. There were 2 people in the hallway. One was Carla Bessie in a charcoal coat, holding a thin folder. The other was Eleanor Pollard in the same wool coat she had been wearing at 6:18 that morning, holding nothing at all. Silas opened the door. Eleanor did not enter immediately. She stood in the threshold and looked at the apartment. She looked at the fold-out in the living room. She looked at the small bookcase with 24 titles. She looked at the watercolor of the barn. Her face did the same specific thing it had done at 6:18 when she had looked at Wren. She said, "Mr. Vance." Silas stepped aside. He gestured for them to come in. He did not say anything. Eleanor walked into the apartment as if she were walking into a church she had not known existed in the parish she had grown up in. Carla Bessie laid the folder on the kitchen table. It contained the original Cresthaven permit from August 2003, the as-built survey from 2004, and the retrofit calculations from March. It contained also a single sheet stapled to the back of the original permit, which was a calculation page in Silas's handwriting, dated July 22nd of 2003. The calculation page had been drawn through twice with a black marker, but the marker had not entirely covered the ink, and the ink, read carefully, said the same thing the as-built said, 1.3. Underneath, in Hugo Pollard's handwriting, was a marginal note that said only, "Cost reduction approved, HMP." Carla Bessie said, "The board has the page. We have had it since 2004. It was sealed. We unsealed it at 10 this morning." She did not look at Eleanor when she said this. Eleanor did not for a moment look at anyone. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. She did not ask. She simply sat. She looked at the marginal note in her father's handwriting. Her father had been a slim man with very steady handwriting, and the handwriting on the page was very steady. She did not cry. She did not, in the way of women who have been trained for cameras, allow her face to move. She said, after a long moment, I did not know. Silas, who was standing at the kitchen counter, said, I believe you. Eleanor said, He told me the firm built it. He told me the firm built it. Silas said, The firm did build it. I worked there. Eleanor said, He told me you left because of your father. Silas said, I left because I buried my father. He removed my name because I would not sign the change. Eleanor was quiet for a long time after that. Carla Bessie, who had professional courtesies to honor, stepped out to the hallway to make a phone call. She closed the door very gently. Eleanor and Silas were alone in the kitchen with the watercolor of the gray barn and the folder on the table, and the empty plate with crumbs from a 5-year-old's toast. Eleanor said, The ribbon cutting is at 6. The mayor will be there. The insurance carrier will be there. The carrier has already called my office 4 times this morning. They are going to refuse to underwrite the retrofit activation unless the original designer of record consents to the calculation revision in writing. She said it the way a person says a sentence she has been holding in her throat. The designer of record is you. Silas said, Yes. Eleanor said, Will you consent? Silas said, I will consent under 3 conditions. He laid them out the way he had once laid out a load calculation. First, the retrofit calculation will be revised against the as-built diameter, which is 1.3, not 1.4. The carbon fiber sleeve specifications will be increased for the southeast quadrant. I will review the revision myself before stamping. Second, Pier 14 will be physically inspected today before the activation. Hairline cracks may already have begun under the static load. If they have, the activation will be postponed. Third, he paused. He set his hand flat on the table, the way Hannah had used to set her hand flat on the table when she was about to say something she did not want to argue. Third, the original calculation page in your father's marginalia will be entered into the public record at the Structural Review Board. Not to embarrass him, he is dead. To clear the name of the man who drew it, which was me. Eleanor nodded once. She said, All 3. Agreed. At 12:18, while Eleanor was on the phone in the hallway with the carrier and Silas was reviewing the revised calculations at the kitchen table in pencil, the call came in from the building. The southeast footing in the parking garage had developed 2 hairline cracks during the morning's pre-activation load test. The cracks were 3 inches and 4 inches respectively, running diagonal to the pier face. They were small. They were within tolerance for a static load. They would not be within tolerance once the carbon fiber sleeves doubled the lateral load at 6. Silas read the report. He looked at Eleanor, who was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway, her phone at her ear. He said, simply, Postpone the activation. We have time. We do not have any to spare. Eleanor relayed this into the phone. The voice on the other end did not argue. The activation was postponed at 12:22. By 4 in the afternoon, the press attaché Priya Khan had drafted a statement explaining that the activation had been postponed due to a pretest anomaly in the southeast quadrant, which would be addressed through a calculation revision overseen by the project's original designer of record. The statement did not name Silas. Silas had asked her not to. He did not want his name in a press release. He wanted his name on a permit. The carrier withdrew the threat to refuse underwriting at 4:30. The mayor's office, which had been informed at 1:45, rescheduled the ribbon cutting for the following Thursday. The 2 council members agreed without comment. The retrofit calculations were re-stamped at 5:15 on a kitchen table in a brick walk-up on Greer Avenue by a 51-year-old man in graphite gray coveralls who had not, until that morning, held a drafting pencil in 19 years. Carla Bessie witnessed the stamp. She drove the documents back to the city office herself. Eleanor stayed after Carla left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking at the watercolor of the barn. She said, "He never mentioned you." Silas said, "No." Eleanor said, "I gave a TED Talk on inheritance. I called it The Inheritance of Stone. I talked about him. I never knew there was a memo in the archive." Silas said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Eleanor said, "There is a position. Director of Structural Integrity. The firm has needed one for 9 years. The pay is what it should have been." Silas considered this for a long moment. He said, "I have a condition." Eleanor said, "Tell me." He said, "I pick up my daughter at 3, every day. If a meeting runs past 2:40, I leave the meeting. If a deadline falls on a kindergarten parent-teacher day, I move the deadline. Those are not negotiable." Eleanor said, "Of course." She said it the way a person says a sentence she has herself wanted to say her whole life. She told him then, in the small voice she used for things she did not ordinarily tell people, that her own mother had died when Eleanor was 7. Her father had not picked her up from school after that. He had hired a driver. The driver had been a kind man named Ferris, who had brought her a juice box every afternoon, and Ferris had been, in the small way of paid kindnesses, the only person who had asked her about her day. She had not, until this morning, thought about Ferris in 15 years. She did not say more about her father. She did not need to. Silas, who had been listening, said only, "I'll do the work. But the work doesn't include forgetting what was done. It includes correcting it. That has to be the deal." Eleanor said, "That is the deal." She stood. She put on her charcoal coat. She paused at the door. She said, "I'm sorry. For this morning. For my father. For the 19 years." Then she left. The internal review at Pollard Architects began on the following Monday. It was conducted by an outside firm at Eleanor's specific request. It found, among other things, that Devon Halsey had been informed of structural inconsistencies in the Cresthaven retrofit calculations as early as January by a junior engineer named Aidan Morris, and had instructed Aidan in writing to consider the matter closed. Devon Halsey was, by Friday of that week, no longer at the firm. There was no press release. There was no public statement. His office was emptied on a Saturday. His access card was deactivated by the end of the month. Aidan Morris was promoted to senior structural reviewer. He was 28 years old. He had a small son. He had been told by Devon 8 months prior that he would never make senior at Pollard if he kept questioning the math. Aidan had kept questioning the math anyway. Silas asked to meet Aidan in his second week. They worked well together. They still do. The retrofit activation, when it finally took place the following Thursday, was attended by the mayor, the insurance carrier, both council members, and a small invited group that included Carla Bessie, Aidan Morris, Margaret Sloan on a borrowed mobility scooter, and Wren Vance, age 5, wearing a small gray coat and holding a paper crane that had, by now, very soft edges. Silas was there in a charcoal jacket and a graphite gray tie. He did not give a speech. Eleanor gave a short one. She thanked the Structural Review Board. She thanked the carrier. She thanked the original designer of record by name, which was the first time that name had been spoken publicly in connection with Cresthaven Tower in 21 years and 4 months. There was applause. Silas did not look up during the applause. He looked at his daughter, who was standing at his hip, holding the crane. Wren looked up at him. She did not smile. She nodded. It was a 5-year-old's nod, but it was the only one in the room he was waiting for. He picked up Wren from kindergarten that following afternoon, the way he picked her up every afternoon. The kindergarten was at St. Mary's, 12 blocks east of the apartment. He was there at 2:58, which was the time Margaret Sloan had taught him to be there, which was 2 minutes early. Wren came out at 3:01. She was holding a piece of paper with a drawing on it, in graphite pencil, of a tall, gray building with a small bird sitting on the top floor. The bird had been colored in carefully. The building had not. She said, "Papa, is the building better?" Silas crouched. He took the drawing. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the small bird on the top floor. He looked at the careful pencil lines of the building. He said, in the voice he used for nothing else in the world, "Yes, little one. The bones are strong now." Wren considered this with the gravity that small children bring to grown-up answers. She put the drawing in her left pocket. She took the paper crane out of her right pocket, where she had been keeping it during recess. She unfolded the crane very carefully, with the precision of someone who had been watching her mother fold things since she was old enough to watch. The crane became a small, flat piece of pale gray hospital paper. There was, on the inside of one of the folds, a sentence in Hannah's handwriting that Silas had never seen, because the crane had been folded before he had been given it, and Wren had never offered to unfold it. The sentence said, "For my Wren, tell Papa the bones are strong." She did not, of course, read the sentence. She could not read cursive yet. She refolded the crane, slowly, exactly the way Hannah had folded it. She tucked it into Silas's shirt pocket, over his heart. They walked together to the bus stop on the corner of Greer and 8th. The sky was overcast, the color of unwashed linen. The maple at St. Bridget's was 6 blocks south of them, just starting to lose its leaves. The leaves were graphite charcoal gray. Wren held her father's hand. The paper crane sat in his shirt pocket, against his heart, where Hannah had told her, in a sentence Silas would not read for another 4 years, to put it. They reached the bus stop. They waited. The bus came at 4:18. They got on. They sat near the front. Silas looked out the window. Wren looked at her father. She said, very quietly, "Papa." He said, "Yes, little one." She said, "I am proud of you." The bus pulled away from the curb. The graphite gray afternoon went on around them. Silas did not, for the rest of the ride home, trust himself to speak.